I was only 17 at the time, right in the middle of my teenage years. My life revolved around school, my friends, and of course, the excitement of summer vacation. It was then that my friends and I decided to take a cruise through the Caribbean. It was supposed to be the trip of our dreams, an entire week of parties, paradise beaches, and unforgettable moments. The promise of fun seemed irresistible, and I could hardly wait to leave behind the stress of exams and enjoy every second. I never imagined it would turn into a nightmare. The trip started just as I had hoped, full of sunshine, music, and fun. During the first few days, we explored the islands, partied, and relaxed on the white sandy beaches. But soon, something started to bother me. I was still getting used to the vastness of the ship and the sheer number of people when I began to notice a strange man watching me. He seemed to be everywhere I went. It wasn't a coincidence. He was actually following me. I tried not to pay much attention, thinking it could just be my imagination or a misunderstanding. But the more I tried to ignore him, the more he appeared. It was during an excursion to one of the islands, when we were exploring a small local town, that the feeling of being watched became more evident. We were strolling along the beach, taking pictures and laughing, but I couldn't help but notice that man, middle-aged, dark hair, with a forced smile. He was always at a distance, but looking at me so intensely, it felt like he could see right through me. At first, I thought he was just another tourist, but the way he acted began to make me feel uneasy. Something wasn't right. The next day, I was leaving my cabin to meet my friends when he appeared. Suddenly, there he was, right in front of me, with an even stranger smile on his face. "Hi," he said, his tone something I couldn't quite place. It was as if he knew something I didn't. I tried to be polite, but the sense of discomfort took over me. He continued talking, asking trivial things about my trip. And then, the situation took a completely unexpected turn. He told me he had some gifts for me, and that if I agreed to have dinner with him that night, I could receive something very special. I froze. I didn't know what to do. The man was standing there, speaking with an unnerving calmness, as if it was the most natural request in the world. I politely declined, but he insisted. "I really would like to get to know you better, and I think you'll like my gifts." What was he saying? I no longer knew how to react. My mind was racing, and something inside me screamed to leave that place as quickly as possible. So, without another word, I turned my back and ran to the elevator, my heart pounding. In the next 2 days, I tried to avoid any contact with that man. But he was always there, somewhere on the ship, as if he were waiting for me. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was at the party hall, on a particularly busy night, when he appeared again. He approached me with that disturbing smile, and this time my fear turned into panic. I no longer knew what he wanted from me, but one thing was clear. I had to confront him. I took a deep breath, turned to face him, and without being able to contain my anxiety, I screamed, "Stop following me! What do you want from me?" The room fell silent. Everyone turned to look at us. It was a surreal moment. People started gathering around, asking what was going on. Some looking on with curiosity, others with visible discomfort. Trembling, I said he'd been bothering me since the start of the trip, and that I wanted him to leave. Within minutes, some of the passengers went to get security. The man tried to stay calm, but his smile was no longer the same. I saw his expression change, but he didn't say a word. Security escorted him out of the hall, and before he disappeared, he gave me one last look, a look I will never forget. It was as if he had lost a battle, but something deep in his eyes told me he wouldn't give up so easily. After that incident, I never saw that man again. What happened to him, I don't know. And honestly, I don't want to know. The cruise continued until the last day, and as much as I tried to convince myself that it had just been a scare, the image of that man still haunts me sometimes, with his disgusting smile and his malicious gaze. Ever since that trip, I've been a bit paranoid when it comes to men. If I notice any man staring at me for too long, I start to feel scared and begin to sweat. Today, I'm married, and I told my husband this story. He was furious and said that if anyone approaches me or our daughters, I should tell him immediately. It was supposed to be the honeymoon of my dreams. Just me and Lucas, far from everything, in the mountains of Saragossa. We chose a secluded cabin, overlooking the trees and the tranquility that only nature can provide. The weather was perfect, cool and pleasant, the scent of wet earth in the air, and the silence only broken by the heavy rain pounding on the windows. We spent the days exploring trails and enjoying the local cuisine. But that night, the wind seemed stronger, and the rain hit the windows almost aggressively. We were both tired from the hike, so we curled up in the room, watching TV, relishing the warmth of the heater. Everything was so peaceful, until we heard the knocks. The sound was coming from the door, as if someone were hammering on it from the outside. I looked at Lucas, lying beside me, and he gestured for me to go check what was going on. I walked to the door without any concern, thinking it might be a neighbor or the person who managed the cabins. The rain continued to pound against the windows, but the sound of the knocks was unmistakable. When I opened the door, I found a man drenched, completely soaked, with lost eyes as if he were desperate. He asked for shelter, but there was something in his expression that immediately made me uneasy. Something didn't feel right. Not knowing what else to do, I asked him to step back, but he didn't move. He started insisting, saying he needed help, that he was lost in the storm. My intuition told me not to let him in. So firmly, I told him I couldn't help him, but he didn't seem to understand. When I turned to close the door, he lunged forward with terrifying force, shoving it with his shoulder, trying to get inside. I screamed for Lucas, who rushed over and pulled me back as the man kept forcing his way in. His face was twisted with rage, and he was shouting disconnected words that I couldn't make out because of the rain and my racing heart. Lucas tried to hold the door, but the man was strong and seemed determined to get in. After much struggle, Lucas managed to shut and lock the door. We ran to the bedroom, but we both knew the door was flimsy, and he kept banging on it with such force it felt like it could break at any moment. That's when Lucas remembered the gun he'd brought for personal safety. I always thought it was an exaggeration for him to carry it, but in that moment, I didn't question it. He grabbed the revolver from the backpack while I tried to call the police, but the call wouldn't go through, probably because of the storm. Everything was happening so quickly, and fear took over me. The sound of the knocks grew louder, as if the man was using something to try to break the door down. Lucas pointed the gun at the door, shouting for him to leave, but it seemed like the man either didn't hear or didn't care. Panic gripped me, but I knew we couldn't let him in. When he finally broke through the door, Lucas stepped forward, gun still in hand, and demanded he stop. The man wasn't surprised, nor was he intimidated. On the contrary, he took another step forward, as if he was determined to break in no matter what. That's when my survival instinct kicked in, and on impulse, I threw myself between them, managing to push the man away with a strength I didn't know I had. I don't know what would have happened if Lucas hadn't been there to protect me, but he acted quickly, subduing the man until he collapsed on the floor, completely disoriented. With Lucas's help, we managed to hold him down until the police arrived, and the man didn't try to resist anymore. He was visibly out of control, but at the same time, he didn't seem to have the strength to fight back. When the police finally arrived, they calmed us down and took the intruder away. I couldn't stop shaking, and even now, I feel like I'm trapped in a nightmare I can't forget. In the first moments, it felt like the world was moving in slow motion, and all I could think was, why didn't he just leave? The feeling of helplessness and fear stayed with me for a long time, and it took me a while to understand what really happened. The scariest part of it all was discovering who the man was. When the police identified him, we learned he had a criminal record and was dealing with serious personal issues. Nothing could justify what he did, of course, but it did explain his irrational and aggressive behavior. He was running from something, but we didn't have time to find out exactly what, as the police focused on getting him away as quickly as possible. Deep down, I felt relieved that he hadn't done more harm to us. But the sense that danger had been so close, just a few feet away the whole time, left a heavy weight on my chest. After everything that happened, the inn made sure to review their security protocols and, as an apology, offered us a free stay. At first, Lucas and I didn't know what to do. Our honeymoon had turned into a nightmare, and the thought of staying there, in a place that should have been peaceful, felt strange. But after talking it over, we decided not to let that night ruin our trip. The fear was still very much present, but we tried to focus on each other, on what we could still enjoy together. Sometimes, fear is something you overcome just by having the right person by your side. We were looking for something different, you know? My husband and I have always enjoyed exploring quieter places, away from those crowded, heavily visited beaches. When we found an alternative route on the map, the promise of a secluded beach, far from any commotion, was irresistible. The sky was overcast, giving the landscape a somewhat eerie tone, but we didn't mind. In fact, we thought it might add something special to the day. We started driving down the side road, and everything felt so calm, almost strangely quiet. There was no one around. Only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees and the hum of the car engine filled the air. Everything was fine until the road began to narrow and steepen. With each turn, the terrain seemed rougher, and the surrounding vegetation closed in, creating an even more isolated atmosphere. We passed a few signs indicating that we were in a remote area, with not many options for help nearby. That's when we saw the car. It was crumpled against a tree, its bodywork all dented, as if it had lost control and crashed there, but there didn't seem to be anyone around. My husband decided to get out and take a look, despite my urging him not to, and I stayed in the car with a knot in my stomach. A sense of discomfort took over me, but the worst was still to come. My husband walked away from the car, heading toward the wreck, and I stayed there, watching him go. The wind seemed to pick up, and the silence was becoming unbearable. Then, I heard something strange, like a snap coming from behind the vegetation. Something wasn't right, and my heart started to race. I didn't know what it was, but I felt an increasing sense of pressure. Then from the corner of my eye, I saw something move in the underbrush. When I looked closer, I realized there were two figures crouched down, almost camouflaged among the bushes. They were there, motionless, as if waiting for something. And what caught my attention the most was what they were holding, something large and metallic. They looked like machetes. The shock was immediate. My body went numb for a moment. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. My husband also noticed the figures, and when he took a few steps toward them, that's when they moved subtly but threateningly. I didn't know if they were injured people, if they had some kind of intention, or if they were just there by chance. But the fact was, the situation made no sense, and the sense of danger was palpable. I didn't know what to do. I looked at my husband, who was already turning back toward the car with a look of panic on his face, and that's when he ran toward me, not looking back. He jumped into the car quickly, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. I could hardly breathe. Fear was paralyzing me. The car was already running, and he started it without wasting any time, accelerating so fast that I felt my stomach churn. The road, which had seemed peaceful before, now felt like a maze, with the vegetation closing in even tighter. I looked behind, expecting to see those figures appear, but what I saw was emptiness, a deep silence. My husband, his face pale, drove with frantic determination, not caring about the sharp turns or the risk of losing control of the car. He just wanted to get out of there, and I was just as desperate to escape that place. The atmosphere changed completely. The mystery that had once seemed intriguing was gone. Now it was just fear, pure and simple. We had no idea who those people were or what they were doing there. The road seemed endless, but finally in the distance, we spotted a gas station with dim lights flickering in the darkness. We didn't think twice. My husband made a sharp turn and parked at the first available pump. We were out of breath, still unable to fully process what had just happened. The feeling of being in a safe place was a relief, but the fear still gnawed at me from the inside. The attendant at the station looked at us curiously as we approached, but something in our expressions made him realize that something was wrong. We tried to explain what had happened as clearly as we could, but our words were shaky. The attendant listened in silence, without interrupting, just observing us with an expression that seemed to mix curiosity and concern. When we finished speaking, he seemed to hesitate for a moment, looking to the side as if weighing what to say. Finally, he pointed in the direction of a small town, saying that the police station was there. His voice was calm, but there was something in the way he looked at us that made me uncomfortable, as if he had heard similar stories before. "Go straight and then take a right," he said, and without another word, he turned back to continue with his work. My husband, still in shock, started the car, and we didn't even discuss whether or not to go to the police station. It felt like it was the only option. We needed to report what had happened, as if somehow that would make sense of what we had just gone through. When we finally arrived at the police station, we were met by an officer who seemed more interested in the details than in comforting us. He wrote down everything we said, but didn't ask many questions. "Don't worry, you're in a safe area now," he told us when we were done. But inside, I knew that nothing would be safer than being far away from that road, far away from everything that had happened that cursed day. After leaving the station, the feeling of relief was fleeting. The town seemed so normal, so far removed from what we had just experienced, but it was impossible to forget what we had witnessed. We decided to continue our trip, though the secluded beach we had wanted to visit no longer held any importance. Our search for tranquility had turned into a nightmare that, despite everything, we were trying to leave behind. With each kilometer we drove, my gaze fixated on the roads around us, as if that feeling of being watched would never go away. Even now, I think about that road, the figures crouched behind the bushes, and the machetes they held so calmly. What were they doing there? Why were they hidden in such a mysterious way? We never knew, and perhaps it's better that way. What happened that day, on that deserted road, changed something in us. Although we tried to move on and enjoy the rest of our vacation, our eyes were always alert, and fear, in some way, still followed us. I don't know what that crumpled car was, or who those figures were, but something tells me it wasn't a coincidence. And honestly, I hope I never have to return to that road. We were driving from Chicago to Orlando, on the trip of our dreams to Walt Disney World. It was a long drive, but everyone was excited. We decided to drive through the night, hoping to arrive early the next day. And around 10 p.m., we passed through an almost deserted area with no other cars in sight. The silence was heavy, and I confess, it was even a little uncomfortable. But as we were just another family on a road trip, I didn't think much of it. The kids were quiet in the back seat, watching a movie, and my wife and I were talking about plans for the parks. That's when, out of nowhere, a black car appeared right behind us. It came fast, much faster than it should have for that empty road. I was shocked when, suddenly, it sped past us and stopped right in front of our car, forcing us to come to a halt. Fear hit me instantly. Before I could think of how to react, two figures jumped out of the black car and ran toward us. They were armed. The one in front had a gun in his hands, and the other, behind him, seemed to be keeping watch, also armed, pointing his gun toward us. I won't lie. Terror immediately took over. I tried to stay calm, telling my wife and kids to be quiet, but everything inside me screamed that something was terribly wrong. The man in front came up to the driver's side window, aiming the gun at me. The sound of the metal against the glass made my spine freeze. He yelled, demanding we hand over all our valuables. Panic set in immediately, but I knew I couldn't make any rash moves. My only concern was protecting my family. My wife looked at me, her eyes wide with fear, and the kids were completely silent, probably not understanding what was going on, but feeling the tension in the air. I tried to think clearly, wondering if there was any chance of escaping. But with the gun aimed at me, I realized I had no choice. I tried to keep my voice steady as I began handing over my wallet and phone, but the feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. The thief began yelling louder, as if getting frustrated with my delay. He kept saying that if we didn't hand everything over, he would do something none of us wanted to see. I saw the gun glint in the moonlight, and in a split second, the terror turned into desperation. That's when the man, who had been standing guard, took a step forward and threatened that they wouldn't hesitate to shoot if we didn't obey. The pressure kept mounting with every second, and part of me wondered what would happen if we didn't give them everything, or if we tried to escape. The fear was so intense that for a moment I couldn't think clearly. Then, the sound of a siren cut through the silence of the road. At first, I thought it was just a distant noise, but soon it grew louder and closer. I couldn't believe it. A police car was approaching, but I didn't understand how it could be such a perfect coincidence. The thief at my window looked at the police car with wide eyes and immediately made a move to pull away. But before he could react, the patrol car was already right next to us, and the officer, realizing the situation, made his approach. He ordered the men to step away, and in seconds, the tension that had dominated the air turned into frantic chaos. The robbers tried to run back to their car while shooting at the police. The gunfight was quick and terrifying. The officer in front didn't hesitate to act, and the robbers couldn't respond quickly enough. In less than a minute, everything was over. One of the men was dead on the spot, and the other was shot in the leg and surrendered. The sound of the police arresting the man was like an instant relief for me. I was in shock, but at the same time, relieved to know my family was safe. After the incident, we got out of the car, and one of the officers came over to ask if we were okay. The air felt lighter now, though my mind was still trying to process everything that had just happened. The police asked a few quick questions, but I could barely articulate my answers. The fear was still visible on my face, and I was trying to piece together what had just occurred. I felt the relief beginning to take over, but the tension in my body wouldn't subside. My wife was still in shock, and the kids, though safe, were visibly scared, their eyes fixed on me, as if waiting for some kind of explanation. I tried to calm them, telling them everything was fine, that the worst had passed. But even with the words, the silence of the road and the weight of the situation lingered, watching us, as if the scene would never fade. After a while, the officer explained that he had been on routine patrol in the area. They had been on alert due to some reports of suspicious activity, but they never imagined they'd encounter something so serious. We had to follow them to the station, and after clarifying everything, the officers made sure to check if we were okay and offered to escort us for a while until we left that more isolated area. We thanked them, but with our minds still reeling, my only desire was to continue the journey and forget what had happened. As the patrol car followed us for a few miles, I couldn't stop thinking about how everything could have turned out so differently if the police hadn't appeared at that moment. The fear had settled into me, and the trip, which had once seemed like just an adventure, became a constant reminder of how important it is to never underestimate safety, especially on the more deserted roads. It was on a sunny June morning that Carlos and I decided to begin our honeymoon along the Amalfi coast. We arrived at a charming seaside resort with a breathtaking view of the Mediterranean. The salty air of the sea welcomed us as we strolled along the wide terrace, admiring the vibrant colors of the houses around us. The first week promised to be perfect. Days at the beach, delicious dinners, and boat trips that seemed straight out of a postcard. It felt like every moment was carefully orchestrated to make our trip unforgettable. On the first day, we dove headfirst into the local beauty. We spent hours relaxing on the golden sand beaches, soaking up the sun and the sound of the waves. In the evening, we explored the resort's restaurants, savoring fresh seafood dishes and Italian wines. Each meal felt like a celebration of our love, accompanied by laughter and endless conversation. The nights ended with quiet walks along the lit promenade, where the soft sea breeze lulled us, making us feel truly connected and happy. On the third morning, we woke up with the same positive energy as before. We decided to explore more of the nearby villages, visiting small local markets and enjoying the art and culture of the region. Every corner revealed something new and enchanting, from colorful crafts to cozy cafes with panoramic views of the sea. We spent the afternoon on a boat ride where the sun shone brightly and the crystal clear waters mirrored the joy we felt. Everything seemed perfect, and I could hardly wait for the romantic nights still to come. On the third night, after a particularly delicious dinner at the resort's restaurant, we began our usual walk along the promenade. The full moon illuminated our path, casting long and mysterious shadows around us. It was then that I noticed something strange. A man was standing at a distance, watching us. I tried to ignore it, but he seemed to be subtly following each of our steps. A chill ran down my spine, and I shared my concern with Carlos. He, at first, tried to reassure me, thinking it might just be a coincidence. However, the feeling of being watched persisted, that uncomfortable sensation of someone staring at you, which suddenly made the night less enchanting and more unsettling. The next day, we tried to resume our normal routine, but the tension was still there. Every time we walked around the resort, I found my eyes scanning the surroundings, hoping to spot that man again. Carlos noticed my discomfort and tried to comfort me, saying that there was probably nothing to worry about. Still, the sense of insecurity wouldn't fade, making each moment a little harder to enjoy. We decided to spend the afternoon exploring more of the area, but my mind was constantly preoccupied with what might happen. On the fourth night, after another romantic dinner, we decided to take our usual walk along the promenade. The night air was cool, and the lantern lights reflected off the gentle waves of the sea. Suddenly, I felt a presence much closer, something more than just distant observation. The man we'd noticed on previous nights was now right in front of us, his eyes fixed on me. He tried to approach, right in front of my husband, telling me how beautiful I was and how elegantly I was dressed. As he reached out to touch me, Carlos immediately sprang into action. He confronted the man aggressively, stepping in front of me. In that moment, I was desperate, pleading with Carlos to stay calm. At any moment, this could escalate into physical aggression. With a raised voice, Carlos demanded the man leave us alone. With a smirk on his face, the man backed off and fled, leaving us both shaken and relieved, but also deeply disturbed by what had just happened. Still trembling from the confrontation, we decided we couldn't ignore what had occurred. We sat in our room, trying to process the adrenaline and fear that still haunted us. Carlos held my hand, trying to calm me down, but I knew we needed to take action. The next morning, we approached the resort management and explained everything that had happened. The staff was incredibly helpful, offering immediate support and assuring us that they would do everything possible to ensure our safety. They told us that the man had caused trouble before at the resort, which only made us more apprehensive, but also helped us understand that we weren't the only ones affected. We then decided to contact the local police, giving a detailed report of every unsettling moment from the previous nights. The officer who responded seemed serious and committed, promising to investigate the case thoroughly. The following days were filled with a mixture of fear and caution as we avoided solitary walks and stayed close to each other. The constant presence of the authorities at the resort brought us a renewed sense of security, but the fear of the man's potential return still lingered. However, thanks to the support of the resort staff and the police, we were able to enjoy the rest of our honeymoon with more peace of mind. Always vigilant, but grateful for taking the necessary steps to ensure our safety. I've always hated flying, but work left me no choice. As I shuffled through Heathrow's packed terminal, I tried to focus on the idea of seeing my family in Spain by Christmas. The crowd pressed in, the air heavy with perfume and sweat, and by the time I boarded, I was already on edge. My seat was wedged between two strangers in the middle of a cramped row. On my left was a man who looked harmless enough, headphones on, eyes closed. But the man on my right, from the moment I sat down, something about him set every nerve in me on high alert. He kept tugging at the skin on his arms, scraping until angry welts formed. He muttered softly, words I couldn't quite catch, but they dripped with something vile. I tried burying myself in my book, but I caught him staring, unblinking, whenever I glanced up. The cabin lights flickered faintly against his restless hands. My heart fluttered in my chest as I told myself this flight was only 2 hours. I just needed to endure it. Midway through, he leaned in close enough that I could smell something sharp and antiseptic on him. His voice was barely louder than the engine's hum, but I heard every word. Do you think it's wrong to hurt someone if they deserve it? My stomach twisted. Heat rushed to my face. I just forced a shaky smile and looked down, pretending his question hadn't sliced through my comfort. The rest of the flight was a suffocating loop of tension. I tried to lose myself in the paragraphs of my book, but every turn of a page felt heavier. He didn't stop picking at himself, nails scraping flesh, a soft, repetitive sound that turned my nerves raw. The man on my left remained oblivious, lost to whatever he was listening to, leaving me alone in my private hell. Each minute stretched. The overhead lights seemed too bright, the seatbelt too tight, the recycled air too thin. Every time I dared glance sideways, I'd see a tiny smile tugging at the corner of his mouth, as if savoring my discomfort. When the plane finally began its descent, relief washed over me. I clutched my purse, praying the wheels would touch down soon. He didn't speak again, just kept fussing with his nails, as though he was cleaning something dark from beneath them. The instant we landed, I stood, my knees weak, and rushed off without a backward look. The corridors to baggage claim felt too quiet, and the distant murmur of airport announcements sent uneasy echoes through my mind. At the carousel, while waiting for my suitcase, I dug into my purse, determined to distract myself, to reassure myself I was safe. That's when I found the note, folded so tightly it was almost stiff. My heart hammered as I opened it, the paper shaking in my fingers. The message was scrawled in jittery handwriting. I'd like to see what you look like without your skin. My world narrowed to the cramped space around me. I searched the crowd frantically, but no one looked familiar. The very air felt predatory, as if he might be lurking just outside my vision. The ordinary bustle of arrivals now seemed sinister, charged with hidden threat. I stood there, panicked and trembling, aware that I was now truly alone with this terror, and he was somewhere out there, still watching. I stuffed the note deep into my purse the moment I found it, and snatched my suitcase from the carousel the second it appeared. Every face in that arrivals hall seemed menacing now, and every echo of footsteps on polished floors made me flinch. Even my own breathing sounded too loud, too panicked. I hurried outside, practically throwing myself into the first taxi I could find. As the cab pulled away, I stole glances over my shoulder, half expecting to see him silhouetted in the terminal's fluorescent glare. In the cramped back seat, I smelled the stale vinyl and diesel fumes, and though I tried to steady my breathing, the words on that crumpled scrap of paper thrummed in my mind. I'd like to see what you look like without your skin. By the time we reached my parents' home, I was shaking. My mother welcomed me with a bright, relieved smile, her arms warm and comforting. But I couldn't meet her eyes for long, not without feeling a prick of panic. I mumbled something about needing rest and slipped upstairs. My old bedroom felt oddly cramped and distant, as though I were trespassing in someone else's memory. I sat on the edge of my childhood bed and carefully unfolded the note again, running my fingertip along the shaky handwriting. A part of me sought some harmless explanation. A stupid prank, a misunderstanding. But the malice in those words radiated from the paper. They'd follow me through the years, lurking in the corners of my mind. I tried to push through the holiday in silence. When I ventured outside, I scanned the streets, my heart lurching at every stranger who lingered too close or watched me too long. My parents noticed my quiet mood, but I brushed it off, feigning jet lag or a lingering cold. I never spoke of the note, as if saying it aloud would conjure him back from wherever he'd vanished. Nights were worst. My sleep was fitful, punctured by dreams of his unblinking stare. I'd wake up sweaty, heart hammering, and reach for the lamp just to confirm I was alone. Months passed. Back in London, the memory took on a surreal quality, like some feverish episode. I nearly convinced myself it had been an overreaction. But one afternoon, scrolling through the news, I saw his face. A suspect arrested in France, accused of heinous acts that twisted my stomach as I read each sentence. My hand shook so violently I nearly dropped my phone. In that instant, all the old terror crashed over me, wrenching me back to that cramped plane seat, to the note's ragged edges digging into my fingertips. Afterward, I changed. I'm wary now. I no longer feel safe sitting beside strangers in cramped spaces or walking alone at dusk. I sense eyes on me even when no one's looking. Sometimes, late at night, I can almost hear his nails scraping at his skin. I kept the secret to myself, never telling my family or friends, as if carrying it alone might keep them safe. This is the first time I've set it down in words, and even now, I'm checking over my shoulder, uneasy at the memory that never quite lets go. We rented that chalet because it promised exactly what we needed: seclusion, peace, and the chance to unwind far from London's noise and chaos. It was just the four of us: Thomas, Amelie, Lucas, and me. When we arrived that crisp Friday morning, the place felt like it had been pulled straight from a postcard. Nestled deep within a Swiss alpine forest, it was perfect. Snow thick on the ground, air so sharp it stung your lungs, and silence so absolute it was almost disorienting. The nearest town was a winding 15-minute drive away, and there wasn't a single neighbor for miles. "This place is too perfect," Amelie quipped, with her signature dark humor as we unloaded the car. "Watch it turn into a horror movie." Lucas laughed, claiming he'd be the first victim, while Thomas rolled his eyes. At the time, I chuckled too, but her words lingered. Something about the absolute stillness made me uneasy, though I brushed it off as city nerves. The weekend started as planned. We hiked short trails, cooked elaborate meals, and laughed by the fireplace while Lucas butchered his fondue experiment. Amelie filled her camera with pictures, insisting the light in the mountains felt otherworldly. On Monday, Thomas and I drove to town for more supplies, leaving Lucas and Amelie to relax at the chalet. When we returned that evening, the first note was waiting for us, pinned to the front door, a scrap of crumpled paper with jagged scrawled letters. "Beware of who's watching." We assumed it was a prank. Lucas laughed it off, spinning absurd theories about local traditions, but Amelie's face drained of color. "There are no footprints," she murmured, her voice barely audible as she stared out at the undisturbed snow surrounding the chalet. That observation made my stomach twist, but we all agreed to let it go. Pretending it didn't bother us was easier than facing what it might mean. That night, though, the atmosphere shifted. The warmth of the chalet felt oppressive, its silence now suffocating. We talked over dinner, but the words felt hollow. Every crackle from the fire and every groan of the wooden beams made us jump. When I thought about checking the perimeter, the blackness outside the window swallowed my courage. By Tuesday morning, the facade of normalcy shattered. The second note was inside the chalet, folded neatly and left on the kitchen table. "You shouldn't be here." Amelie's hand trembled as she held it. We'd locked every door and window before bed. This wasn't a prank, and no one could pretend otherwise anymore. Lucas and Thomas searched every inch of the chalet, but nothing seemed out of place. That was somehow worse. Nothing out of place meant someone had been here and left without a trace. That night, every creak in the chalet felt amplified. Lucas propped a chair against the front door, as though it would do any good. Amelie refused to turn off the lights in the living room. I was the last to head to bed, and even then, I lay awake, my ears straining for anything unusual. Around 3 a.m, I heard it. Slow, deliberate footsteps crunching in the snow outside. My chest tightened, my body frozen in place. Curiosity clawed at me, even as fear screamed for me to stay still. Finally, I forced myself to the window. The curtain was partially open. For a moment, I wanted nothing more than to shut it, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But I looked. Outside, under the dim porch light, stood a figure, motionless. It lingered at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the light, as if it had been waiting there. The hood concealed its face, but its height and posture made it seem unnaturally still. My breath hitched as I strained to make out any details, but there were none. Just the silhouette, tall and faceless, with hands tucked into its pockets. It wasn't moving, but the longer I stared, the more certain I became. It was looking directly at me. My chest tightened. I couldn't call out to the others. The words stuck in my throat. Instead, I stood frozen, hoping it was some trick of the shadows or a cruel illusion. But it wasn't. After what felt like an eternity, the figure turned, slow and deliberate, and disappeared into the forest. It didn't run or hurry, just melted into the blackness, leaving me trembling by the window. The next morning, I told the others. Lucas tried to laugh it off, suggesting it was a lost hiker, or maybe even a shadow cast by the trees. But I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his smile didn't quite reach his face. Amelie didn't even come to the table. She stayed curled in bed, her pale face barely visible under a heap of blankets. When Lucas and Thomas decided to check the area around the chalet, I stayed inside with Amelie. She stared at the extinguished fireplace, silent, her eyes fixed on the charred logs like they held answers. When the others returned, their faces were grave. They'd found footprints. Large, deliberate impressions circled the chalet in a looping, erratic pattern. What chilled us most was the starting point. Nowhere. The prints didn't lead in from the forest or away. They just appeared, looping around the house before vanishing into the trees. Lucas suggested it was a hunter, but his voice wavered, and no one challenged him. We didn't want to admit what we were all thinking. That night, we debated leaving. The chalet, once cozy, felt oppressive, its walls too close, its silence suffocating. Then came the third note, slipped under the front door. It bore Amelie's full name, followed by a single, cryptic sentence in jagged handwriting. "You know what you did." Her face drained of color as she stared at the note, her hands trembling. "I don't know what this means," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But something in her expression, something guarded, made me question her. Lucas tried to break the tension with a joke, but no one laughed. The message was too personal, too deliberate. We packed in silence, our hands shaking as we stuffed our belongings into bags. Outside, as we loaded the car, Thomas froze. "Wait," he murmured, pointing to the ground. The snow, which had started falling earlier, lay undisturbed around the vehicle. No footprints, no tire tracks. It was pristine, untouched, as though the car had been dropped there by some unseen force. We didn't linger to question it. Lucas floored the gas, and the chalet disappeared behind us, swallowed by the forest. The drive to town was a blur of tension. The snow thickened, muffling the world outside, and the road felt like it might close in on us at any moment. Amelie sat silent in the back, clutching her blanket like a lifeline. Thomas and I took turns scanning the woods, our eyes desperate for any sign of movement. But the forest was still, too still. The absence of sound felt wrong, like we were being followed by something just beyond our perception. When we reached the town, we went straight to the police. We told them everything: the notes, the figure, the footprints. The officer's skepticism faded as we spoke, replaced by something that looked like unease. He admitted there had been reports before. Other tourists who had stayed at that chalet, who had seen things, received messages, felt like they were being watched. No evidence had ever been found, no suspects identified. His words offered no comfort, only the chilling realization that whatever haunted that place was beyond explanation. Back in London, none of us talked about it. The experience hung over us like a storm cloud. Emily, once the life of the group, became quiet and withdrawn. Lucas tried to joke about it, but his humor felt forced. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. Every shadow, every unfamiliar sound brought me back to that night. The worst part? I still don't know why it happened. There was no logic, no resolution, only the lingering fear and the certainty that some things can't be understood, let alone escaped.